Hey you, welcome to Above The Jpeg, the place where you can find the latest NFT trends and the most reliable NFT information for entrepreneurs and investors. This is Kango Lin, your host. And this week we have Warwick Powell, which is the founder at Smart Trade Network, a layer 1 solution. And he also partnered with the Australian government on shipping all the Australian beefs to China on the blockchain. There's some really amazing stuff that he's done with the blockchain and the NFTs. So, today I'm gonna ask him all about it. And this is really solid use cases. So stick around and learn what's possible. Do it in your country. Who knows? You might be the next one.
How are you?
Warwick, it's Warwick. What's going on, man? How you doing? Are you in Australia?
I am in Australia. I'm in Brisbane on the east coast, and it's winter here.
So welcome to the show, Warwick. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Above The Jpeg, man.
Yeah, great to be there virtually.
Yeah, so Warwick, I've been waiting for this interview for a long time. Dude, ever since we met in Austin, I have been such huge fan of yours and your work in blockchain. So today we're going to show the people all of what you're doing with our audience. And just honestly, for me personally, I want to learn from you. I want to learn what you're thinking so that young folks like us who are listening to the show will be able to learn the thought process and learn what's working, what's not working. So starting off, sir, I'd love to get a little introduction from you because you're everywhere. I saw you on Australian national TV. I saw you in China, or I saw you in politics. You're everywhere, sir. So tell us a little bit about you.
Well, after you've been around for a little while, you can be everywhere. Being everywhere is just a function of time. Look, I'm based in Australia these days. I've been in Australia for 46 years. I first came from Hong Kong, and I did all of my schooling in Australia. I went to 8 different schools, actually, during my schooling here, which meant that I traveled a lot across a very big continent and lived in small communities, big communities, urban areas, rural areas. And I think that gave me a couple of perspectives on the world. One was that the world's a big place because I was a migrant to start with. So I appreciated the fact that the world can be connected by air travel and trade and all those sorts of things. The second thing is that it gave me a very clear sense that the way that, well, and I only knew this as I got older and reflected upon these experiences, but that the connections between cities and the hinterlands and the rural areas of our economies is actually a really important set of linkages. And those linkages are usually underappreciated, which has led to, over time, challenges in regional economies, outside of capital cities, which I think are both unfortunate, but also things that we can do something about and need to do something about. And we've seen the consequences of not doing something about that impact communities across the world. So whether it's Australia or North America or throughout Europe, smaller regional communities have experienced significant economic challenges over the last 30 years, to a point where some of those have hollowed out, where people have left them, or where there are no longer viable economies in these communities and people are now surviving on one kind of welfare or another. And all of this is avoidable. So that was another lesson that I learned, through going to all these different schools throughout, my time. And I think the third thing really is that by virtue of traveling so much, I came to be comfortable with the need to be able to adapt to different environments and to work with people from different places, different walks of life and different perspectives. And that's important because ultimately, being able to find common ground, even though there are many things that people have different perspectives on, is a good starting point to being able to get along. And getting along seems to me to be better than not getting along. Not getting along is an expensive way of living in the world.
Yep.
It means that you deny yourself access to lots of things, lots of opportunities, ways of learning, access to more economic or more efficient production systems, or what have you. But right down to then putting a lot of effort and resources into fighting, and fighting is very draining. It's much
draining.
easier to not do that. So look,
That's
that sort of ended up with me doing work in regional economic systems and ultimately into distributed ledgers. So that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing at the moment.
So the experience, I know you learned a lot about economy back in the academic days, and then you moved towards, I believe it was in the political world, right? And then is it right? You went from the academic to political and then business.
Most of these stages have been partly accidental. You stumble into things because you're pursuing an interest or a passion. And I actually started my working life with a view of becoming an academic, and I was completing my PhD, my doctorate, and
Yep.
and doing some sessional teaching at university. And one late night, probably around 3 a.m. in the morning, I was marking a big pile of exam papers, and they were all handwritten, right? Handwritten in pencil usually. And I decided that this was not something I wanted to do. The idea of spending a lot of my life marking handwritten exam papers seemed crazy to me.
And how old are you?
I'm 52 now.
I mean, how old were you? My bad.
I was 21, 21, 22.
My age.
Yeah.
You're already a professor my age.
No, but I was tutoring. So I was lecturing and tutoring. And at that time, I'd been offered an opportunity to work for the Director General of the Office of the Cabinet in the Queensland State Government. So the Director General of the Office of the Cabinet is the chief executive, basically, of the coordination department of all of government in my state, Queensland.
The Prime Minister.
Well, yeah, and the Director General was a guy called Kevin Rudd, and Kevin became Australia's Prime Minister some years later.
Wow.
So,
wow.
I'd been offered an opportunity to work for Kevin a couple of times prior to eventually grabbing that opportunity and throwing myself into what became 80 to 90-hour weeks, doing a myriad of things in government, touching on all sorts of diverse areas of public policy concern, from education and training policy through to dealing with closure of meatworks, social, economic, legal policy issues. But probably one of the defining projects I worked on when I worked for Kevin was on a project that was called something like the National Strategy for the Teaching of Asian Languages and Cultures in Australian Schools. So this was in 1992-93, and the national government and all the state and territory governments of Australia agreed that a report needed to be prepared concerning education and training on Asian languages and cultures. And Queensland was delegated the task of putting that together, and that fell specifically to Kevin, and Kevin assembled a team of people to support him in the research and in the drafting.
You were the expert.
Well, I was just part of the research team at the time. I was just a young guy, and but the result of that work was a confirmation that Australia's future economically and security-wise, as a result, lay in Asia. Australia, as a big continent with a small population in the Asia Pacific, had to find a future that was heavily connected to what was going on in Asia, number one. Number two, to make that reality, Australia needed to develop a skills base that was knowledgeable about Asia. And that meant a focus on languages and cultures education from a very young age.
Interesting.
So the strategy identified 4 main countries for the purposes of implementing this strategic approach, which was China, Japan, Republic of Korea, and Indonesia. And so 4 core languages were therefore identified: Chinese Mandarin, Japanese, Korean, and Bahasa Indonesian as part of this strategy. And every state and the Commonwealth government committed to funding this strategy to make learning these languages mandatory for Australian school children from the age of, from memory, 9 years and up. So the idea was that after 20 odd years, Australia would have a significant cohort of people in their mid-20s through to mid-30s who would have deep Asian literacy, culturally and linguistically. Now,
that's
that
amazing. I mean,
yeah. So look, that was probably the defining experience that I had in that space. I then moved from there to working in the Mines and Energy Minister's office, where I was exposed to the mining industry. And Queensland is a state that has significant mining resources, both in terms of the metalliferous mining sector, particularly lead, zinc, copper, a bit of cobalt, sand, silica, and those sorts of things, all the way through to coal. So I was quite exposed to dynamics within that sector, and then into the energy industry when Australia went through a big process of reforming the energy supply system across the country, which until then was very much driven by publicly owned utilities. But in the mid-90s onwards, Australia progressively introduced more explicit market mechanisms and corporatisation of the energy supply sector. And I was involved in the early days of the thinking around market designs and that sort of stuff. And all of those things that I sort of was exposed to back then have actually become quite pivotal when you move into the blockchain distributed space, because market designs, game theory, mechanism design, and all those things are actually key.
It all ties back to the blockchain, you know? I mean blockchain is not new.
Information systems. Yeah.
That's right. You know, I as I interview a lot of folks on this podcast, I realized that the blockchain and every innovation that comes out of the blockchain isn't standalone new innovation, right? Blockchain is great and everything, but it requires so much background in whatever people are trying to improve and innovate with the blockchain technology. And I think that's one thing that you've done extremely well, sir. You know, talking about some of the very, very notable and prominent projects that you worked on. Oh my gosh, Smart Trade Network and Beef Ledger, we gotta talk about them. And I just flew to California, but in my house in Austin, I have a chocolate that has the tracking from Smart Trade Network, which is your layer 1 platform. So we gotta talk about that, right? So Smart Trade Network, sir.
Yeah, Smart Trade Networks is a project that has emerged from about 2016. And it came about because I was involved in cross-border trade in food systems mainly. And we kept coming across 2 problems. One was product authentication, so there was a lot of product fraud. And the other one was supply chain payments. So supply chain payments were very lumpy, and they were sporadic, and there were always friction and problems. And to keep supply chains going, the participants in those supply chains had to basically get supply chain finance. And supply chain finance is often very expensive. If you're financing livestock, you're paying up to, between 11 and 12%. Small business
Wow.
finance for factoring was anywhere up to 18% interest. So it was a very significant and costly way of keeping a supply chain going. Now, these two problems, which is the payments problem and supply chain finance on the one hand and product authentication on the other, were usually dealt with by two very different types of people. So the product fraud problem was dealt with by inspectors, customs, scientific labs, police,
That's right.
and all that sort of stuff, right? That was the one thing. On the other hand, the payment stuff was dealt with by financial engineers and financial products manufacturers. Now, come 2016 or so, I really thought that these two problems were actually two sides of the same coin, and that smart contracts deployed on distributed ledgers could, in theory, resolve these two issues at the same time. And the way that I often describe supply chains is that in one way, they're really circuits of information flow or circuits of data flow, where information about products and processes flows mainly in one direction. And when that information satisfies the requirements of the buyer or the finance provider, the money data flows in the other direction. Okay, so these two bits of data are actually fundamentally connected. So if we can resolve data integrity and product integrity on the one hand, then the money should flow quite easily on the other hand. So that was how I started in this space back in 2016. And in 2017, we launched the Explicit project to apply some of our early days thinking in the beef supply chain. And we did that largely by accident because we were already doing some things in that supply chain, but also because we took the view that the beef supply chain was very fundamental to the lives of lots of people. So it was going to have some impact, but it was also complex. And complex for us was good for two reasons. One was that it allowed us to learn lots of things. And two, it meant that there was a lot of barriers to entry, which meant that we probably didn't have to rush so much. So we could take some time in figuring out some of the issues involved.
And you guys were co-founding this with the Australian government, right?
Yeah. So we kicked off a project and became participants in a cooperative research centre. So the Cooperative Research Centre, or CRCs, as we call them, is a scheme that is run by the Commonwealth Government, the Australian government, together with universities and industries. And the idea is to bring resources from government, universities and industry together to undertake cutting-edge research and development. And that's what we did. So we kicked off a project called Export Smart Contracts, I think, which was focused around this question of addressing cross-border payments using smart contracts. Now, all of that sounded easy. And of course, when we first started, I think we assumed that there was maturity in technology and that we would be able to execute, incredibly quickly. The reality
everybody
was
coming into blockchain for the first time thought that. I think even today, there's more and more youngsters like us coming in and encounter the same issue.
And it's of course nowhere near as mature. There are lots of issues, and they're complex things. So the work that I often joke and say that my working assumption was that I'd finish this project in 6 months and move on. And 6 years later, we're getting close. So look, we started working on that and we discovered lots of things. So part of the R&D journey, of course, was to discover things. And we learned a lot about the limits of smart contracts. We learned a lot about the challenges in data collection, the limitations around relying simply on distributed networks for data integrity if you don't also think about how data is collected and who collects the data. So we started thinking about information systems as supply chains themselves, right? So we either manufacture data or we collect data. We then triage that data. We filter it in effect. We then validate it. We then store it. We then make it available for use, right? And there's this production system for data. And a lot of blockchains in the early days were very much focused simply on a very narrow range of validation requirements and storage. That was it.
That's right.
But it didn't deal with the collection or the manufacturing of data in the first place. And subsequently, of course, there's been a lot of discussion around things like oracles and that sort of stuff, sort of off-chain data sources.
So
and
Smart Chain Network has its own oracle, which is to be able to collect.
That's right.
With our
and so what we ended up doing, we did our first version. We did a couple of test runs. So our first lot of work was actually done with some partners in China using Hyperledger Fabric. And that enabled us to ship the first blockchain tracked Australian beef into China in early 2019, I think it was, or early 2018. So that was the first implementation of these things. And we also explored things like RFID chips, NFC chips, and other ways of creating a connection point between the database and the physical objects. We then migrated into developing the technologies and the smart contracts to be deployed on the Ethereum public network, the mainnet. And so all of our work since has been built in an EVM compatible environment. The problems we encountered in doing that were sort of twofold. One was that gas fees were fluctuating all the time, which made it really hard in a real world setting where margins in supply chains were very thin but stable. If someone said to me, how much is it going to cost? And I can't actually give them an answer to that.
And that's exactly the same problem that I ran into with when I first talked to the first customer we had with Victory XR. They say, how much is it going to cost, Kango? And I said, well, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. It's this price right now. And they're like, how are you expecting me to buy the solution when you can't tell me how much it's going to cost?
Can't budget, right? So you sit down with the chief financial officer and you say, look, let's do a 6-month budget, and you actually can't. So that was the first issue. Subsequent to that, we also did some concrete tests within our own environment, which I'll describe in a moment, but which showed us that had we undertaken what we did on the public network, it was actually going to be economically unviable for some of the supply chains we were dealing with. The second challenge that we had was that the public networks brought a lot of data security on the basis that, in fact, it had a lot of strangers and anonymous nodes keeping in alignment, right? Creating a consensus among strangers. That sounds good. And for game theoreticians and others, there's something very sexy about being able to solve those kinds of problems. The problem was that in a real life supply chain environment, many actors actually were very hesitant about data being stored and validated by anonymous strangers, with a risk that in fact that data was being stored by potential competitors. Okay, so
that's right.
So there was a lot of a recoil to the idea of data networks being run by a network of anonymous strangers. So put aside the philosophical arguments about distributed ledgers and all those sorts of things.
I mean, it's not like a one case fits all solution in I think in the blockchain world, And I was actually talking to founder of Motab Lab, which they help Hollywood studios to store all of their props in on the blockchain, and they don't want anybody to see them. So ended up they start using this private chain. So how cold are you, sir? Like, are you cold out there?
Yeah, it's a bit cold, but that's what we ended up doing.
That's what you ended up doing.
I'm actually in my home office, which is built into the side of a hill, so it's actually the coldest part of the house. But we ended up rolling out our own private chain in the end, in response to those two problems. And so we
So now it's
deployed
gas free.
a proof of authority network. Well, it means that we control whatever the gas really needs to be, which means we
Gotcha.
stabilize the cost.
Gotcha.
So even though at a technical level, the transactions are paid for with a thing called the STN token, because we mint the STN tokens, we can manage this network really as a conventional standard data storage as a service environment.
Got you. And so for the audience out there that doesn't have adequate understanding of this, because a lot of times what will happen is that people, we don't have enough information about something and we're like, hey, why would people use blockchain for it, right? I just wanted to read a paragraph here. It's so shocking, and I got it off Charles' LinkedIn actually. So this says, for the readers out there, it says there are over 45K beef cattle producer across the country in Australia, with a national herd around 27 million heads of cattle. The industry employs about 200K people, and the industry export about 70% of the annual production in its third largest export in the country, in the world, actually, the beef export. And here's a shocking part. The off-farm value of the beef industry from 2016 to 2017 was almost 17 billion Australian dollar, and the value of export was $7 billion. As demanded for beef growing markets like China, the risk of meat fraud and safety increases. A robust credential platform is needed to ensure the reputation and the value of Australian beef industry is protected, as well as the data. I think I read it from somewhere. It says every 3 grams of beef in China, every 3 grams of Australian beef in China, 1 gram wasn't real beef, and another gram wasn't really Australian.
Yeah, look, there's the food fraud generally across the world is an expensive problem. I think it's the PwC report estimates that food fraud is a $50 billion problem a year.
Wow.
So
especially in China, because I remember
it's across the world. But
I see.
And it happens in places where we least suspect it as well. So, but in a large economy like China, where demand growth was going through the roof and where supply is physically constrained, that's the perfect environment for 2 things to happen. One, for prices to go up. And the minute prices go up, it attracts either efforts to dilute products so that you can, bring products that use.
So India might be the next.
Yeah, and so the market context drives fraud, right?
I see. Because I remember growing up, there were problems. I grew up in China, and there were problems about food safety back in the day, and the government really had to try really hard to get rid of them, and it was a real problem. And a lot of people in America don't think about it, especially my peers. When I tell them about, putting food on the ledger and ensure food integrity, they're like, but not every part of the world has this privilege.
Tangle, we had exactly the same reaction when we raised this issue around food integrity. A lot of people in Australia didn't really appreciate the issues involved, because here the number of reported cases of food safety issues are actually quite low, and so in the public's mind, the risks of food safety problems arising in Australia are actually quite low. So there's just a different context. So context drives priority.
And now, honestly, as a person who come from a I wouldn't say third world country, but a country like China, developing country, experiencing food safety and seeing babies die on the news, I know that this technology is revolutionary and is saving a lot of people in those countries. This is not just lucrative, but it's also helping and saving people in those countries. And sometimes it's really hard to explain to the Westerners,
Very hard.
but
Yeah.
nonetheless, it's a noble work.
So we focused on that initially, but once we did that work, we were then able to take a step back again and generalize our experiences out of one particular supply chain to create a more general purpose set of technologies. And we did that through a few rebuilds, actually. The initial smart contract was just one ever-growing piece of code, a single smart contract that got bigger and bigger. And eventually that got pulled apart into a whole lot of modules and redeployed as discrete functional smart contracts on our network. And that was important to do. It enabled a little bit more user friendliness from a development point of view, and also it meant that we could do software upgrades and maintenance with quarantined impacts before we pushed out some of the new versions of things. So, and where that all led us to was ultimately designing a supply chain infrastructure that was really focused around the idea of data integrity in supply chains, and mainly focused on, I guess, what I call the asset side of the ledger. So remember I described earlier that supply chains is really a system of flow circuits where money flows in one direction when data about things flows in the other. A lot of people have been very focused around the money side of the ledger, whether it's about how we can mint our own money, cryptocurrencies, stable coins, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's been a lot of focus around the money side. We've actually been focused on the asset side. We haven't been focused around the money side for a whole lot of reasons. But probably fundamental to all of that is a recognition and a belief that money by itself actually has no value until it's related to something else.
100%.
And those something else's are things that human beings find useful or valuable in either very fundamental ways. They're things that we need to survive, or things that are less fundamental but nonetheless bring enriched existences because we need them to have enjoyable lives. So if you think of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we see value ultimately as being driven by the hierarchy of needs. So money by itself, anything can be money. It's a social convention. It's a means of payment and a means of exchange. But it only means something in the context of the other side of the ledger. Okay. So we focused on the integrity of the other side of the ledger.
That's
and
right.
Smart Trade Networks then has developed a series of smart contract tools that enables us to deal with supply chains generically through the application of what is called an REA accounting scheme. So it's resources, events, and agents, which is a computer science-driven supply chain accounting schema that was developed in the early 80s, actually, by some computer scientists and others.
Wow, that's long ago.
And we adopted it and then took out the bits that we wanted to use for this version of the implementation. There's lots of pieces of the REA ecosystem that we've left on the table for the time being because they weren't justified for now. They were too expensive to do, or the data collection was impractical. And we focused on our ability to essentially register digital assets as
right.
Either assets in and of their own right, or
And our selfie,
or as digital twins of something in the analog world, right? And so from the early days, so this is from 2019, we started using NFTs. We didn't really see them as NFTs per se. We saw them as, we called them in-house as digital asset identification certificates.
Yep.
And we've shortened that now to digital asset certificates. But for us, they were important because they actually dealt with a different problem. And the problem was, if we could authenticate the physical product, it's still left unanswered a second problem, which is how do we authenticate the fact that the person selling me that product is the legitimate custodian or owner of that product? And in some supply chains, there's actually a lot of grey markets and theft and that sort of stuff.
That's
So
right. It's
I could say to you, you can validate this product on chain. You can scan the RFID chips or whatever it is, and you can come to some level of confidence that this product is legitimate. But the question that sits in the back of your mind then is, am I the legitimate owner, or are you buying hot property? And so we introduced within our own ecosystem the use of NFTs, in effect, as certificates of custodianship. So if you were to buy something, not only did you want delivery of the physical products, but you also wanted delivery of the associated
digital,
NFT.
authenticated, right?
So you've
Wow,
got the two.
sir, this is
Right.
fascinating. This is really fascinating, Warwick. I think I have to get you back for another show somewhere soon. But no, we're gonna get to the most important question for the day, the ultimate battle. Now you have been in Australia. Now you have been to Texas. You've tried a Texas brisket. You've had Australian beef. Which one is better? Texas brisket versus Australian steak?
Look, the most memorable thing that I had, I think, was a visit to one of the famous Texas barbecues where I had where I had bison ribs. So I'll say that it's the bison ribs that were the standout for me from my visit to Texas. Unique and memorable.
I heard you guys were having too much brisket that day, too much beef that day.
Look, even though we did work in the beef supply chain, and from time to time when we were doing road shows with some of our beef supply partners, we would have to eat a lot of beef for 3 or 4 days in a row.
Oh, wow.
I must confess that I don't actually eat a lot of beef in my normal day-to-day life.
Because you eat too much already.
Well, I like to keep it for special, memorable occasions, and
gotcha.
And that way I can appreciate all the things that go into, putting something in front of you on a plate, because a lot of work does get put into it, and it's really easy to take all of this for granted. And I think that if you sort of take some of these things for granted too often, you lose perspective on the efforts that people go into, and
that's
the
what we have here in America with sugar, chocolate. No one's gonna judge you. But yeah, so sir, last question, the real last question.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about putting on another chain? Maybe Polygon?
Yeah. Look, and in fact,
that's a good chain.
Yep, and in fact, we have some tools on Polygon. So we have deployed some multi-sigs on Polygon that enables us to support our project partners in their own governance. So our multi-sig, organic multi-sig protocol helps our project partners build collaborative decision-making systems, which is essentially DAOs. So we do that on Polygon now. We also have some staking tools on Polygon.
Cool.
So the way we use staking tools, for example, is, you stake tokens. So the STN5, we've got STN5 is one of our tokens, and it's a membership reward token basically. And so if you've got this token, you can stake it and access other services. So the websites will query your wallet to see whether you've staked STN5s, and if you have, then you can access different things in that environment. So we already do some things on Polygon, and it would be great to bring our supply chain infrastructure into the Polygon ecosystem. So we built, for example, a little demonstration tool that we call Beetle, which is blockchain-enabled asset tracking, light and easy. And Beetle is a mobile app on iOS and Android, and it's essentially a stripped-back version of our more comprehensive supply chain asset tracking tools. And it's just a bit of fun, right? Where I can take a picture of we call it an asset, but it could be an event, right? Of anything. Just take a photograph, write a little description of it, and then save that to the blockchain. Now, that little bit of fun, tool is really a way of teaching people about blockchain. So I use it really to introduce people to the idea of distributed ledgers, and also what digital assets and digital asset management means. Now, that little app is actually 2 clicks of a button or 2 smart contracts away from being an NFT minter. We just haven't enabled those functions in the app.
Maybe we can work together. I don't know something.
I think that would be super fun, right? To enable that app to be an NFT printer maker, and push an NFT straight onto, say, a Polygon NFT marketplace. I think that would be a fantastic way of being able to bring people on this digital asset management journey, which is what we use this tool for, right? And I'll give you some really much more grounded examples. There's lots of examples in things like artwork and all that sort of stuff. But I think that there are some other examples where social and ecological values can be driven by the way that we use these tools. So we know that in carbon capture, one of the big issues is to be able to effectively prove that there was a before and an after. So you look at a piece of land and you want to see whether or not there were trees on it before and trees after. This tool allows us to take a photograph of something,
and we'll be able to know the history of it,
and then you can
wouldn't be changed.
it, and then because it's timestamped, you can prove the 2 times of these photographs. That's actually pretty important, right? And so that becomes, because
it can be rigged when the country does those jobs. It can be rigged, right? I think a lot of countries rig those stuff. So I actually recently got certified with the UN RAP process program. So this is really fascinating stuff you're working on.
Imagine empowering a community to essentially be a third-party validator, so that people who are taking photographs of their urban landscapes, or when they're on field trips traveling across a country and they're taking photographs, we enable people just to upload those essentially as public records of a particular environmental state at a certain time, but they own it, right? So that NFT is something that they own. Now, and this is something we haven't done yet, but imagine then saying, look, this is a set of common digital infrastructure. And if I wanted then to use that, because that was actually a photograph of my land, right? And I want to use that to prove that I've done certain work over a period of time to generate a certain amount of carbon offsets, and I'm going to create something. Well,
there's no controversy.
I would then actually pay the people who made those photographs for the evidence that they've given me to prove that I've done what I was doing on the farm. And so we start to have a fabric of data commons that supports people's value creating activities, where you've got, and so in effect, we all become an oracle. Each of us becomes part of a social oracle network.
That's right.
You take pictures of buildings, you can take pictures of any other assets, and you say, look, this is my lived environment. Or you take pictures of a park with trees and playground equipment and other things in it.
You get paid for collecting data.
You get paid for collecting data on behalf of the world, and in our case, most of the data we'd collect in the first instance is visual data, right? And town planners, I think, would find this sort of stuff incredibly interesting and useful, before and after and all that sort of thing. So I think we, let the imagination run wild. But if we did something like this on the Polygon network, I think it would be a fantastic project that brings grounded value to the world of Web3 and distributed ledgers.
You know,
We should do something.
we're actually a Polygon partner. I might even be able to hook you up with them and see, there's more things we can do together, maybe.
Well, let's have a look at that. As I said, our team has done work on the Polygon network. We like using it for particular applications that we use. And what we actually end up with, for instance, in some of our websites is an ability to query two networks. So we query the wallet that then gives permission for the website to query the STN blockchain to deliver information from the STN blockchain. So we actually have a dual wallet, essentially, or a dual network view.
That's right.
From one website. So we could do stuff like that as well. I think that would be very, very cool.
We'll talk about it offline. Let's talk about it offline.
All right.
Gotta be respectful of your time, sir. But yo, thank you so much, sir, for coming on to our podcast. And I wish you have a wonderful day.
Well, let's catch up again soon. And I'm always happy to, find time to talk to, good friends in the US and people who, care about how technologies can be used to, support the ambitions and energies of people around the world to make the world a slightly better place tomorrow than it is today.